So, our next performer this evening, I'm really glad we got her to come. She's, I was thinking, because I watched the first show, and I was thinking how nice it is to have a smart person on stage talking about smart things. It's good for your brain. She is a media critic. You know her probably from her work, Feminist Frequency, among other things. This is her first JoCo cruise. I know. Please welcome Anita Sarkeesian.
Oh, it's time for school. Are you ready for school? Excellent. All right. I am going to talk a little bit tonight about how women have forced their way into the games industry and how, because of that, games are getting better. It's getting late, y'all. Three noteworthy things happened in 1978. The first thing was that Space Invaders was released. You can cheers that, that's cool. Even if you're too young to have played this game as a child, you'll no doubt recognize its pixelated aliens who have become an almost universally recognized symbol of video games. They are seen everywhere, from the emoji on your phone to mosaics on buildings around the world. The Space Invaders didn't just invade arcades, they invaded our culture. I know. By the middle of 1981, over 4 billion quarters had been deposited into Space Invader machines. The premise of the game is simple. Genderless, identityless others from space are invading our space here on Earth, and they must be eliminated. The second thing that happened in 1978, Carol Shaw joined the team at Atari, where she designed games like 3D Tic-Tac-Toe. This made her the gaming industry's first ever professional female game designer. Moving on from Atari to Activision, she later designed the game River Raid, in which she employed an innovative, River Raid, some of you remember that shit? In which she employed an innovative procedural generation algorithm so that the game created the same world every time without using up the console's very limited memory. River Raid was a smash hit for Activision, selling over 1 million copies, and is widely considered one of the best games on the 2600. Before I continue, I forgot my little preface. This talk has harassment and trigger warnings and content warnings for all kinds of nasty stuff. There's not a lot of it, but enough that if you might not want to be witness to that, or your children might not want to see that, feel free to leave. Or stay, whatever you feel like doing. Anyways, we're not there yet, but do you want to know what the third thing that happened in whatever year we're talking about? 1978, that's the year. The third thing was that on July 9th, 1978, over 100,000 women gathered and marched in Washington, D.C. for the Equal Rights Amendment to guarantee equal rights for all U.S. citizens regardless of gender, and to ensure that there was no legal difference between men and women when it came to jobs, marriage and divorce, and property ownership. I don't know why you're clapping, because that shit didn't pass. Or get ratified, as Twitter actually'd me about, apparently. So thanks, last group of people. But it was the largest march ever for women's rights in the US up until that point. Of course, with women's rights and indeed our basic humanity so explicitly under attack in the US lately, the massive women's march last January surpassed it. But in 1978, this march was incredibly significant. And like I just spoiled my punchline, it didn't get passed and still hasn't been passed, which is sad. But I like that you clapped for equal rights. Like, you know, that's just what equal rights. Yeah. All right, so it is absolutely coincidental that these three events all happened in the same year, but now, 40 years later, these events, significant for both games and for gender equality, parallel three of the most pressing issues in games today. Who remembers Flower? Yeah, totally unrelated to this talk in every single way, but it's so soothing, isn't it? Yeah, so I like to use this before I preface some things. If you're here at this talk, I'm going to take it as a given that you generally agree with the basic idea that racism and sexism are bad, and that generally speaking, equality and inclusion are good things. I only have so much time, and I can't spend the hours it would take to establish the reasons why women are actually people. Hopefully we are already on the same page here. I'm going to talk critically about systems that have privileged straight white men at the expense of others. If you are a straight white man who finds yourself feeling defensive at some point during this talk, that's okay. If that happens, maybe just ask yourself why you're feeling defensive, and for the next 30 minutes or so, try to give me the benefit of the doubt that I am not personally attacking you and might have some points worth consideration. Okay? Awesome. They're clearly not the audiences I normally speak to. Oh, that ended abruptly. Sorry, that was so soothing. I was like, the rocking and the fun. Okay. In 2004, the wonderful feminist Nirmal Puwar released a book entitled Space Invaders, Race, Gender, and Bodies Out of Place. No, the book was not about video games. It was about how women and marginalized folks were beginning to enter professional spaces that for a very, very long time had been the domain of white men. Spaces that white men had occupied almost exclusively for so long that it was as if they, and they alone, were entitled to those spaces. As women and people of color began to invade those spaces, they were seen as outsiders. They were seen as not belonging just because of their race or gender. As a result, their presence in these spaces was inherently disruptive. They were challenging norms just by being there. It's wonderfully apt that Puwar chose a video game reference as the title for her book, since video games are an example of exactly the kind of industry she's talking about. Despite the presence of folks like Carol Shaw and adventure game pioneer Roberta Williams, the game industry was in the 80s, in the 90s, and yes, much of the new millennium overwhelmingly populated by white men. In most studios, most creative decisions, such as gameplay decisions, character design, narrative choices, you name it, were made by white men. As women, people of color, queer, and trans folks have struggled to break into games, we often encounter tremendous hostility and hardship. Sometimes there are whole groups of people and entire structures of power that actively work to discredit our opinions and prevent our entry. And even if we do manage to somehow overcome all of that, we often continue to be met with hostility long after we've established ourselves within the industry. However, while the games industry sometimes treats such folks like a harmful virus that needs to be kept out of the system, the truth is that our presence in games is actually beneficial. Carol Shaw and Roberta Williams were innovators in their day, and today it's because of the different skills, talents, and perspectives that Space Invaders bring to the industry that we've started seeing such an improvement in terms of story arcs and character representations in recent years. And that growth matters, because it's become increasingly clear over the past year, we cannot entirely separate representations within the games industry from the way people are actually perceived and treated in our culture. So, a little story. It's May of 2012, and a naive young woman launches a Kickstarter campaign to fund a series of videos examining how women are portrayed in video games. This naive young woman is thrilled when her project is fully funded within 24 hours. Holy moly! She's so excited that the games community is interested in exploring this topic. But word continues to spread on the internet until it reaches some people who aren't so keen on the idea of a woman examining games from a feminist perspective. People who hung out in places like 4chan or the more sexist boards on Reddit. These people make it very clear to our naive young woman that they don't want her saying anything critical about the sexism in their precious video games, and they embark on a quest to do everything in their power to stop her. That's when her naivete comes to an abrupt and painful end. She is rapidly bombarded with an online hate campaign that dwarfs all the get back in the kitchen and go make me sandwich jokes she'd received before. Clearly this was me, and talking in the third person is super weird. Those people I mentioned sure did and often continue to do everything they can to make my life a living hell. Now, not all of the harassment is harrowing and terrifying, though some of it definitely is. Some of it is just lazy and absurd. You'd be amazed how many times someone has sent me a tweet that just says something like, "You don't even play games." I'm like, really? Like, do you tell film critics that they don't even watch movies? They probably do, actually. So I've been attacked for years now. Thousands of tweets and emails are hurled at me because I'm a woman and I dare to have an opinion about a game or thoughts about a character. Plenty of people critique games and write about them, but what these attacks make clear is that the sole reason for targeting me is because I'm a woman. They focus on my gender, my sexuality, the way I look, and the way I act. This horrific treatment is not unique to me at all. It's actually a very common experience for people who work in games and who aren't straight, cis, white men. Just like the spaces Nirmal talks about in her book, Space Invaders, the gaming industry and the gaming media has catered pretty much exclusively to young straight men for so long that those men came to feel entitled to that cultural domain. Women in these spaces were often valued almost exclusively for their appearance if they were valued at all. It's almost as if a lot of gamers bought into the notion communicated by so many games that women's primary role is to serve as sex objects. I'll let you enjoy this photo while I take a sip of water. Don't enjoy it, it's terrible. Okay. The gaming industry's overwhelming domination by white men made anyone else seem like an outsider. And just like the Space Invaders in the game fighting to make it to Earth, it's still incredibly difficult to get past certain barricades to enter this profession. We have to fight significantly harder than a straight white man might for the same opportunities. As women or anyone targeted just for their gender, their sexuality, the way they look, we can rise above hateful comments, we can fend off and try to ignore all the abusive tweets and harassment, we can be incredibly persistent and keep applying even after we've been passed over for one job or not considered for another over and over and over again. And once we make it, invading these professional spaces we'd previously been excluded from, it doesn't mean that those office spaces or studio cultures instantly become any more welcoming to our ideas or perspectives. Sure, we're inside, but we're still seen as outsiders. I doubt that the Space Invaders in the game who successfully crossed those barriers and made it down to the surface were immediately considered Earthlings and welcomed with celebratory champagne and open arms. However, we can work to shift those attitudes that continue to define us as outsiders in those spaces, which brings me to my next point. One way that happens is that voices that were previously excluded or ignored finally speak so loudly or in such vast numbers that they can no longer be ignored. We saw something like this a few years ago in the world of games criticism when more female, queer, and trans critics began to express their opinions about video games. These writers often raised issues that most critics up to that point had ignored. Issues of sexism or racism, harmful stereotypes, and imperialist politics. As this happened, a lot of male gamers got upset and began calling for a return to the days of objective games criticism. Exactly, sorry, I just made, yeah. Someone said, what's that, right? Yeah. I didn't just imagine that? Okay, cool. Yeah, good question. I will answer it. That is criticism that's only concerned with how good the graphics are or how good the guns feel, because that's really the most important part of the video game. But of course, there's absolutely no such thing as objective criticism of any medium or art form. We always bring our own ideas and attitudes about what's important, what's good or bad to any experience with media. It's just that games criticism had been so overwhelmingly defined by the same voices for so long that straight male readers had come to see their criticisms as objective. When other voices entered the scene and started talking about things like sexism in games, they were met with a lot of hostility because previously these aspects of games had been treated as if they didn't matter. Accepting sexism was considered objective. Criticizing it was considered subjective. Even as recently as 5 years ago, it was considered extremely strange and deeply wrong to critique a game for sexism or racism. But just by persevering through the backlash and continuing to write about games, these writers have started to help make this kind of valuable criticism begin to seem normal and acceptable. And as a result, our cultural conversations about games are becoming so much more multifaceted, rich, complex, and rewarding. Space Invaders may have been a massive cultural phenomenon back in 1978, but games have gotten so much more sophisticated than then. They deserve writing that evaluates and appreciates them from a broad range of perspectives. And why are games becoming more sophisticated? Obviously, this has a lot to do with leaps in technology that allow for more realistic graphics, more complex physics, larger, more detailed worlds than ever. But there's also no question that the infusion of experience and perspective that Space Invaders are bringing into game development has played a huge role in changing what we're seeing. When the first episode of my Tropes vs. Women in Video Games series premiered in March of 2013, video game protagonists were still overwhelmingly made up of white men. From Mario to Marcus Phoenix, Nathan Drake to Kratos, white men were the undisputed rulers of the video game realm. Female characters were often relegated to being plot devices rather than actual characters. The damsel in distress who motivates the male hero to come to her rescue, or the murdered wife who motivates the male anti-hero to seek his revenge. Other female characters existed simply to provide the presumed straight male player with a sexualized reward for accomplishing some gameplay goal, or to lend a game's world a supposedly grim and gritty texture through the flippant use of sexual assault as a background event. Today, it's becoming somewhat more common to see women presented as three-dimensional human beings rather than sex objects. For example, The Last of Us Left Behind told a deeply human, tender story centering young queer women.
So stupid. Yeah, that. Now roar. Roar. Ellie, really? Fucking roar! There she is!
And the studio Naughty Dog followed that up with Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, which focuses on the complex friendship that develops between two women who find themselves unlikely partners on a quest together.
Raw talent, a little bit of luck. Hey, nice work, partner. Nice work. Put it there. Jesus, what was that? I'm really embarrassed of you right now.
It's worth noting that both of these games were add-ons or spin-offs to games that did center white men rather than being full-fledged properties designed to center women from the ground up. The presence of women and queer folks on the team at Naughty Dog is an essential part of how they're able to create so many terrific three-dimensional female characters. The studio's efforts to tell different kinds of stories and center different kinds of characters have resulted in exciting games that work to humanize people that games have overwhelmingly dehumanized for so long. They're also just great games with great stories that players of all genders can enjoy and appreciate, and they never would have been created if some women hadn't decided to be video game industry Space Invaders. Overwatch fans? Some of you, there's like 2 of you in the audience. Of course, there's Blizzard's cultural juggernaut, Overwatch, for the rest of you that have never heard of that game. It's a game whose efforts at inclusion have mostly been a joy to witness. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but the overwhelming majority of women in games share the same basic body type, and because of that, so many women never saw a female character in games who looked anything like them. Overwatch's roster of heroes features women with a range of body types, as well as men and women of color from regions around the world. It's also really cool that Overwatch's diversity goes beyond physical attributes and into neurological ones, with its character Symmetra serving as a positive representation of a character with autism. Those efforts at inclusion result in a richer, more vibrant, and interesting game world for everyone, and they help to pull in more players. Excuse me. In July of last year, research firm Quantic Foundry reported that Overwatch has around 5 million female players, which is far, far more than any other competitive shooter. It's actually double than the industry average. However, it is worth noting that for all of their efforts to make the cast of the game diverse and inclusive, Blizzard needs to do way more to clamp down on toxicity in the game's online community and make the actual experience of playing Overwatch welcoming to all kinds of players. Yeah, did you hear that, Blizzard? Hit that. Women who play Overwatch are still very often the targets of harassment simply because they are women. So here is a tiny clip from a video made by Overwatch streamer and Weather Service detailing some of the sexist harassment she encounters in games this is another trigger warning point.
Unfortunate. Mercy's not working out for you, dumb cunt. Learn how to fucking play a proper character. 45 hours, you still suck against girls, just suck at video games in general, you fucking stupid boy.
Wow. Yeah. So, that's pretty horrifying to listen to, and the sad thing is that this happens every day to women playing many different online games. Those very significant harassment issues aside, these games are just a few examples of the kind of change I'm talking about. There are numerous other games, from tiny indie efforts to big studio releases, that reflect this shift. After years and years of cultural stagnation in video games, we're finally seeing some evolution. Games are slowly starting to more often center women, people of color, and queer folks and treat them as fully human. But I'm hardly trying to suggest that we've entered any kind of enlightened age or gaming utopia. There are still plenty of games out there with the same old story about violent white dudes on quests to rescue their endangered wives or daughters. Just watch this commercial for last year's The Evil Within 2.
They took everything I cared about, everything that mattered, but they've got no idea how far I'm going to bring her home.
I'm coming, Lily!
I gotta see her.
Rated M for mature.
Yeah, so for all those dudes who think I'm taking their video games away, still plenty of generic, grizzled white dudes rescuing their daughters with like witchy demon seductresses. I also have seen this trailer a bunch of times, and the daughter's name is Lily. I think that might be one of the most common damsel names for video game characters that are damsels. That's, yes, my fact from me to you. I don't know what's the deal with that name Lily, but there's so many damsels named Lily. All right. So, yeah, yes, great. Sometimes the advances we're seeing in games can feel like a case of one step forward, two steps back. For example, since the series' inception way back in 1985, the core Super Mario Bros. Games have repeatedly relied on poor Princess Peach getting kidnapped by Bowser over and over and over and over and over and over again as an excuse to send Mario off on yet another adventure. 2013 Super Mario 3D World seemed like perhaps a small step in the right direction. It prevented Peach from being damseled yet again, instead making her a playable character in a core entry in the series for the first time since Super Mario Bros. 2 way back in 1988. But the game still couldn't avoid falling into the damsel trope trap. Instead of having to rescue Peach, it's a group of fairies Mario and his friends must save from Bowser's evil clutches. Like, why? I don't understand. And then Peach just falls in. And then you look up her skirt as she flies through the tube. It's great. I love this game, though. Don't get me wrong. I think the kitty suits are like the best thing that's ever happened to video games. And last year's Super Mario Odyssey, while being a wonderfully inventive and delightful gameplay experience, I liked this game way more than I ever thought I would. Sees Peach once again kidnapped by Bowser, leaving it up to Mario to save her from his evil clutches. Again. It's a shame that for all the inventiveness and innovation Odyssey demonstrates in its gameplay, it falls back on the same incredibly tired excuse for a plot device the series has been recycling for over 30 years. I'm going to spoil the first 2 minutes of the game, which I don't really think is a spoiler, but apparently the last group of people thought it was a spoiler. Take note of the tiara. We'll come back to that. Yeah, Yeah, okay, so Peach is kidnapped, so that's shitty. But the game mechanic, the main new innovative mechanic is that you're using a hat as a mechanic in the game. Your friend, your fellow hat, is named Cappy. Cappy has a sister named Tiara. Tiara is on Peach's head, and she is also fucking kidnapped. So you now have 2 female characters who are kidnapped in this game. 30 years fucking later. Come on, Nintendo. For those of you who have finished the game, I'm not going to spoil this, but they do play with the trope a little bit, and I don't think that it's enough to justify the use of it through the whole thing. Alright. Are you laughing because you know what I'm about to say? So, one recent character stands head and shoulders above the rest as perhaps the most outrageous example of gaming's lingering problem with sexism. In 2015's Metal Gear Solid 5, they gave us the character of Quiet. I'm going to show you a little clip.
She refuses to wear clothes. The last staff member who tried to dress her, breathing through tubes. Other than that, she's completely cooperative. She understands English. She never speaks, sweats, or breathes.
So she's the perfect woman.
Well, not with lungs, at least. She breathes through her skin. Clothing would suffocate her. Showers are okay. She can't be submerged.
You see, she can't wear clothes because she breathes through her skin. Just letting that sink in for a minute. You know, it's really, really hard to surprise me when it comes to women in games. Like, I've seen literally everything that there can be, and this blew me away. Like, the backflips to make a half-naked character. It's amazing. We've clearly still got our work cut out for us. The presence of Space Invaders in the games industry is resulting in significant visible changes, but there are still deeply entrenched cultural attitudes in games that often continue to define women as objects and outsiders, and that encourages players to see us that way as well. Having games that center women and people of color is great, but it would also be great if games even went a little bit further, not just by centering such people sometimes, but by incorporating mechanics and telling stories that reflect the actual issues of structural oppression marginalized people face, and acknowledging the need for systemic cultural change. Woo! Indeed, systemic cultural change. Instead, what games often do is present a single individual villain as the cause of all the world's problems and indicate that by defeating that villain, all the problems can be solved. 2015's Assassin's Creed Syndicate is one such game. Now, it has some terrific qualities. For instance, you sometimes play as the very cool Edie Fry, and one of the game's supporting characters is a trans man. It's clearly a game that's reflective of some of the positive shifts that have been happening recently, but it also kind of botched the whole issues of how systemic problems can actually be solved. Forced child labor was a very serious issue in London at that time, and Syndicate acknowledges this with a series of activities called Child Liberation. In these activities, you liberate children who have been forced to work in factories by... You liberate children, but eliminating is not the same word as liberate. Cool. I'm going to start that sentence again. In these activities, you liberate children who have been forced to work in factories by eliminating the corrupt and evil overseers. In actuality, forced child labor required tremendous organization and activism to bring to an end. But here, you can essentially solve the problem of child labor by stabbing some evil supervisors and defeating one very powerful, very bad man. Similarly, in Watchdogs 2, the hero Marcus Holloway, a young black man, mentions that he's been racially profiled and deemed a criminal risk because of his race. So it would seem that the game in some way acknowledges the very real issues of systemic racism in American law enforcement. But as before, that corruption here isn't built into these systems. Instead, it stems from the influence of one very powerful, very bad man, in this case, the CTO of the tech company Bloom, which is essentially just Google, which designed the system that profiled Marcus in the first place. These games suggest that the corruption will work just fine as soon as you take care of the bad people behind all the problems. And unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. Now, obviously, not all games need to involve or reflect actual structural oppressions that exist in our society. So, games like Super Hypercube are awesome and don't need politics in them. But if games are going to comment on such issues, then they need to do it seriously and responsibly. They need to tell better stories. Stories that don't overly simplify some of the very real structurally entrenched oppressions of class, race, and gender that exist in the world, or suggest that all of those problems are just the result of a few bad people. Back in 1978, when women filled the streets marching in support of the Equal Rights Amendment, the sexism they were encountering in their lives wasn't just because of one bad boss at work. It was because of the ingrained systems that allowed women to be oppressed and exploited, that denied them equal rights and paid them lower wages for equal work. And recently, it wasn't because of Trump and Trump alone that women participated in the largest single-day protest in U.S. history. It's because of the deeply ingrained misogyny in American culture that allows him to say and do so many awful things and still remain in the White House. The recent flood of powerful men in Hollywood who got away with sexual harassment for decades are only now beginning to be held accountable for their actions is a testament to just how widespread, entrenched, and systemic misogyny is. If it had been just one man, or 10 men, or 20 harassing women in a system that viewed women as equals, these men would never have gotten away with it. It's only because the balance of power resides so overwhelmingly with men that so many women felt that they had to remain silent. That's why so many women who did try to speak up found their allegations largely ignored. Finally, we've hit some kind of tipping point, and that's great, but it's also terrible that it took so very long and so many women had to suffer in silence. And don't make the mistake of thinking that Hollywood is some kind of isolated case. These kinds of issues are systemic in so many industries because we continue to live in a deeply misogynist culture. Now, the big question is, will what's happening in Hollywood actually lead to some kind of systemic cultural change? I think that the media has a part to play in determining the answer to that. The significantly increasing diversity we're seeing in games is great. It really is. But until our narratives begin to, in some ways, reflect the issues that women, people of color, and other marginalized folks actually face, we're applying a Band-Aid to a deeper wound. And don't get me wrong, that Band-Aid is an absolutely essential part of addressing the issue. It's just not the entire treatment. And make no mistake, the positive changes we're seeing in games are manifesting because of Space Invaders, because of those outsider voices in the media that forced their way in and began to talk about games differently, to shine a light on issues of representation, and because of those outsider talents who made their way into game development as coders and character designers, writers, and world builders. As more and more outsiders make it inside the industry, it's inevitable that the whole idea of who belongs in games will begin to expand beyond the narrow definitions of the past. And it's absolutely vital that this continues to happen because games matter. Games have a real cultural impact, influencing who gets to be seen as fully human and who doesn't. The backlash I mentioned earlier to my Kickstarter campaign, that didn't happen in some kind of cultural vacuum. That was a byproduct of people having spent years and years immersed in a culture that taught them to view and think about women in a very particular way. A culture that taught them not to humanize women or empathize with women, but to see women as helpless or as sex objects or as rewards for a job well done. In the United States, the links between those people who participated in the misogynist gaming backlash and those people who propelled Donald Trump into the White House are painfully obvious. Many of them are the very same people. And we now have a president who utterly disregards the humanity of women, of black people, of Muslims, and trans folks. There's no sugarcoating it, it's fucking tragic. And while of course gaming culture can hardly take all the blame for the state of affairs, it certainly did a considerable amount of damage. But it doesn't have to. And that's what I want you to take away from this today. The increasing range of representations in gaming isn't just cool because it makes games a little more varied, a little more colorful and interesting and fun, which is great and very much needed. It's cool because it pushes back against the sexist and racist attitudes that have been so entrenched in gaming for so long. It reveals the possibility for games to humanize all kinds of people. People who are frequently exposed to media that calls on them to really empathize with others, with people who are different from them, will be far less likely to support politicians and policies that seek to dehumanize others and deny them their fundamental rights. If games can do harm, then clearly they can do good as well. So, if you happen to be a white man, put the laser gun aside and welcome the Space Invaders. Know that their unique experiences and perspectives can only make the work you create together richer and better for everyone. And if you're an outsider made to feel like a strange pixelated alien approaching a place where you're not welcome, know that it's exactly the things that make you different that also make you so valuable and important. It sucks that you still have to fight twice as hard, that you may face hostility or harassment, but we need you. Games are slowly changing, but we have a long way to go still. Each time another Space Invader goes from being outside of the industry to being inside of it brings us a little bit closer to a time when nobody will be made to feel like an outsider again. Thank you.
Anita Sarkeesian, everybody. The last person who tried to shave his beard is breathing through tubes. Aside from that, he's very compliant. He plays guitar, he sings, he has a cruise once a year. But he breathes through his beard. It explains a lot. It explains a lot. I also refuse to wear clothes, but for different reasons.